everyone. Welcome back to week 5. 5 is it? I don't even know. I hope you guys are doing well. So for this week, we're actually moving on to our second rebellion for the Métis. So last week we talked about the Red River Rebellion. This week we're going to talk about the Northwest Rebellion. So if you remember from last week, we were talking about how the Métis, so Louis Riel has already fled to the United States, and the Métis are starting to move further west. So they're starting to kind of go into Alberta, where Alberta and Saskatchewan will be. So as this is happening, the buffalo are starting to disappear because what's happening is those Canadian colonists are also moving and expanding further west, and they're starting to hunt them to distinction. The problem is as those Métis are moving, there's essentially no clear title to the land, nothing is settled, and again, surveyors are starting to move in to parcel out the land. It's also important to note that at this time, the indigenous people are also dealing with some issues. So kind of the main sort of three groups, the Cree, the Blackfoot, and the Sioux are all having to deal with these colonists coming into their land, taking their resources. There's also smallpox epidemics and things like that. So what ends up happening is there's also the building of the Canadian Railway. The settlers are starting to take kind of land along the Northern Rail route, and the railway is taking over the south part. So the Métis are like, holy crap, this is not going well. We need to bring Riel back because this feels like another rebellion. So Gabriel Dumont, which was one of the Métis leaders, is basically sent to the United States to go and get Louis Riel. So Louis Riel at this point is in Montana. He's actually teaching there. The thing is, though, he's not the same person that he was. He kind of, while he was in the United States, started suffering a series of many emotional breakdowns. He spent several years in the asylum. He convinced himself that he was the prophet of the grasslands, things like that. So what ends up happening is Riel decides, he goes back with Dumont. He's like, okay, I'll do this. This is my purpose. So Riel basically sends John A. Macdonald a petition on behalf of the residents kind of around the area where they're staying, which is, remember, in areas in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and is asking for, again, provincial status. So Macdonald, unfortunately, at this point, he delays because he's done this before, and he's a little bit worried that it might end up in the same way. The problem is the Métis are starting to grow impatient. So Louis Riel again decides to declare provisional government. Remember, that's temporary government until a formal government is put in place. Declares provisional government in the village of Batoche. So in March 1885, the Northwest Rebellion actually begins. So there were negotiations that were going to be in place. Crozier and the Northwest Mounted Police go to Duck Lake to negotiate with the Métis. It does not go over well. 2 Métis delegates are shot, 12 of the mounted police officers are killed, and Crozier retreats. You can see the little kind of picture below. So yeah, this isn't starting off great. So while all of this is happening, there's another rebellion that's also taking place. There was actually a band of Cree warriors that are looking to essentially try and fight off these colonists, these Canadian colonists who are coming in trying to take their land. There were 2 gentlemen that are of interesting note. One of them was Chief Big Bear. He was Cree, and he actually resisted because what the Canadian colonists were trying to do is put the Indigenous people onto reserves. Big Bear didn't want that. What he wanted was for his people to be put on a large reserve where they could just use all the resources. He wanted to negotiate. There was also Poundmaker, who was the adopted son of a Crowfoot leader, or adopted son of the Crowfoot, and he led part of this kind of revolt against the Canadians. So Big Bear's men started attacking some of the settlements. So a settlement at Frog Lake, and they ended up killing 9 settlers. Now Big Bear didn't want this. He wanted peaceful resolution. he knew that if they fought against the Canadian government, they would probably not win. There was no way, they didn't have the numbers. He wanted to do negotiations. But many of his people wanted action. They wanted something to happen. They thought the negotiations probably wouldn't go super well or they'd take too long. There was also Poundmaker as well, who attacked Battleford and chased off the settlers. So these kind of two groups are fighting to try and reclaim their land, which is being taken by these colonists. So while all this is happening, while all these fights are going on, the Canadian government decides to retaliate. They send 5,000 troops to the area around Batoche. Part of that to deal with the Cree warriors, and part of that to deal with the Métis. So you had about 725 of the militia attacked the Métis as the troops are being deployed, and pretty much by May, the Métis eventually lost and Louis Riel was captured. So as a result of this, both Poundmaker and Big Bear were sent to prison, and 8 of those Cree warriors who fought were sentenced to public hangings. Now it's really important to note that those warriors, when they were executed, didn't actually get any grave. There was no acknowledgement to them for fighting to defend their land. And if you notice this picture right here, this is actually a plaque. This was done much, much later as a way to acknowledge how kind of wrongful the trial was. The problem is in these sort of trials, these warriors didn't really get a trial. The Canadian government said, nope, you did something wrong and you will be executed. It was the same issue with Poundmaker and Big Bear. They pretty much were just sent to prison. They didn't get a fair trial. And it showed kind of the injustice kind of towards the Indigenous people. Now, the interesting thing was Louis Riel did get a trial. But it was kind of a bit of an interesting one. So Louis Riel had his lawyers, and they were looking to plead or get Louis Riel off on terms of insanity. Because at one point, Louis Riel commented to his men that they were all immune to bullets because he had blessed them, and kind of things like that. He was definitely at certain points unstable. He was still an incredibly intelligent man, but there was definitely something had changed in him. So his lawyers wanted to use that as the defense. Louis Riel, however, refused. He didn't want that. He didn't want to plead insanity. It was also interesting to note that a lot of the jury that was on this recommended they were caught in the middle. They kind of wanted to have mercy. And Quebec warned that if Riel was executed, it was a declaration of war against Quebec. And the trial was in Regina, and unfortunately Louis Riel was found guilty of treason. And John A. Macdonald pretty much kind of refused to intervene in all of this. He said, well, the court system has made its decision, and Louis Riel was basically executed for his crimes. So the interesting sort of argument of who Louis Riel was depends on who you talk to at the time. Many thought of him as a prophet, some thought of him as a traitor, a madman, a hero. Regardless of what people thought of him, in November of 1885, Louis Riel was executed. He was hung at the gallows. And if you see underneath, this is basically his tombstone, which still exists to this day. Okay, so for the assignment this week, rather than doing an article, I actually want you guys to watch a segment of a video. I've provided links to the video in the description below, plus it'll be on your assignment sheet. Essentially, you're just watching, it's about 10 minutes. And instead of it looking at the Northwest Rebellion, it's actually going to look at kind of who Big Bear and Poundmaker were. So this is the link to the video. You can choose to just copy it out of PowerPoint and paste it into whatever server, Or if that doesn't work, you just go onto YouTube and look up Canada Story of Us. It's episode 5. You want to start the video at about 7 minutes and about 13 seconds in, and you're only going until 18 minutes and 50 seconds. So just like a little short segment kind of in the middle of this. And what I want you to do is follow along with your sheet and answer the questions on there and hand it in. If you guys have any questions, please make sure to contact me, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.